Hey, Deserving listeners, it's time to continue watching Jorge and Anfisa. Let's watch.
I love George, but since I arrived, I want him to give me more attention. I didn't think I'd be spending so much time alone here in America. I don't think George realizes that it's really hard for me, and I would like him to be more supporting and understanding.
I think what's happening, and I've been saying this for a while now, that what is actually happening emotionally between the two of them is not what we're actually seeing on the screen. I don't know, but I think she has significant abandonment traumas, abandonment in her childhood. I often will be saying this when I'm reacting to 90 Day Fiancé, so some of you might be thinking, well, doesn't everyone have abandonment traumas according to me? And what I'll say is that no, not everyone does, but a lot of people who are chosen to be on the show seem to. I don't know if this is true, but I imagine that if you are the casting director of this show, you are looking for people that are going to be interesting. And apparently one of the interesting people profiles is someone with abandonment traumas. Think of Angela. These people have a fair amount of interesting presentations on a show that makes them interesting to watch. I'm guessing because they trigger a lot of emotion in the viewership. People without abandonment traumas or without some kind of trauma relationally growing up will probably present as fairly level-headed and thus just not very interesting to the viewership. Now, I know some of you will actually enjoy watching those people. Think of like Kenny and Armando, that kind of thing. And some of you even will ask me, you should do more reaction videos to them. And absolutely, the premise is I can get behind in that. Why should I always be talking about the issues and the problems and the problematic individuals and behavior? Shouldn't I be highlighting what works in relationships and pointing that out? And the answer is absolutely, and I will when I see it. But I find that I just don't really have much to say other than like, that was good. I mean, occasionally I'll have more elaborate things to say. But anyway, the point is that with, and just to sum that up, I just think that I'm boring in general. And if I talk about that, I always feel like, oh, that's probably even particularly boring. Anyway, the point is that I imagine that's what's going on for Anfisa. She doesn't show that in front of the camera, I think because she knows that she has issues. I don't know if she knows the extent or is super aware, but I think she knows enough to not show it while the camera is pointing at her. She will show it when she's calling him and he's on camera. Maybe she doesn't know he's on camera as she is calling and turning off his phone and erasing his computer and all that kind of stuff. Now, people with abandonment traumas don't always do the kinds of things that she does, but if you were modeled that behavior and you have abandonment traumas and you do have some issues with empathy, then you might do those kinds of things. You might key a car, that sort of thing. So I imagine that is what's happening. I don't know. I also imagine that behind the scenes, he presents with more problematic behaviors, either because of his own issues that he exhibited early in this series, the misogyny, that kind of thing, and his own relational issues from the past. But also because when you're involved with someone that has abandonment traumas and has a personality disorder thereof, that individual will be pretty triggering to other people regardless of what their issues are. You could take the most level-headed person on the planet, the Dalai Lama, you put them with someone in an intimate relationship with a personality disorder that is untreated and the person doesn't have much awareness, the Dalai Lama is gonna be they're going to have some issues and they're going to be triggered a lot and their more frustrated behaviors are going to come out and they're going to exhibit some problematic behaviors as well. It's just impossible to avoid, really. So when she's on camera, I think she's trying to be more level-headed, and I think the place that she goes to is a cold place. I think she tries to turn off all of her emotions, and she has a smirk that she often resorts to and a subtle rejection, and when he's on camera, I think he's trying to present as being accommodating and reasonable. And so he's talking to her, and she will roll her eyes, but she'll do it very subtly, because I think she's trying to tamp down what's going on for her. And then when the cameras walk and go home, I think that's when a lot of her emotional issues will come to the surface, and then they'll have these big fights. And then the next day the cameras arrive, and that's when we see what's happening, is the aftermath. And then I think she goes to this more cold, or walls. She'll put up her walls, and she's being interviewed, and she'll say like, well, I want more money and I want more attention, is what she said right here. But I think more fundamentally, she is desperate for closeness. And I don't know, and I think someone even said, they emailed me and said that Anfisa was raised by her grandmother, which points to potential abandonment or something that went wrong when she was young. Maybe her parents died, I don't know. But that can result in a child feeling abandoned, right? And also someone emailed me that recently she graduated, she got some sort of degree, which people were happy for her, and I am too. It's always, as a professor, it's always nice to see that people value education and try to help out their career in that way and learn things. But anyway, so I think for her, but I don't know where they are at right now. Other people are emailing saying, you should look at this. And they're like, well, maybe you shouldn't, because that'll ruin your reaction videos. Apparently there's a whole set of information post this show. I don't know. I don't know if they're together. I don't know if they're apart. I would suspect that they're not together. I'm just going to take a guess based on how things are going, but I don't know. Sometimes people surprise me on the show. So I think when she's being interviewed, she puts up the wall and she says things like, I am only in it for the money. He needs to give me more money. He needs to give me attention. And that's just the way that it is. And I think that it's her way of trying to communicate that she's upset at him without revealing her inner vulnerability. But then when he is in the car and she's badgering him, or he's getting all these texts, you see, I think, a much more real version of her, a much more vulnerable, a much more hurting, desperate version of her. And so I think that's what's happening. And then I could imagine, again, this is complete speculation, she goes through a lot of abandonment and chaos when she's growing up, and she develops these schemas, and her way of managing it is to have a very distant, cold persona that tries to protect herself, and a very demanding, controlling, angry persona that tries to force or alert her attachment figures that she has attachment needs. And there's another persona in there as well that I think is probably also present in terms of her being tender. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes there are moments where her and George do have tender, kissing, looking into each other's eyes, holding each other, crying. I don't know that. It certainly is hard to visualize given what we've seen on screen, but I wouldn't be surprised. For us watching, it's like, well, this is their entire relationship, but I don't think so. I don't think that's true for any of these people. I always think about Yara and Jovi, because when we first saw them over the first 10 episodes, it was just all toxic fighting. And I thought, why are these people together? But then they prevailed, they got married, and now they're happy. And you see another side of them that I'm guessing was absolutely present that entire time, but they just didn't show it to us or whatever. So I imagine that there's a lot of tenderness as well, a lot of deep, deep tenderness from her in particular because of her needs. But anyway, so she's growing up, she's abandoned, chaos, and she develops these personas as a way of trying to manage her schemas and her issues and relationships. And she's trying to date in her hometown. Things aren't going well. We could imagine why, based on this hypothesis, if it were true. She starts to think, well, maybe if I date online, maybe things will go better for me. Maybe if I lean into my strengths as she sees it, meaning my looks, and I can get attachment security through that way. Well, how would I know if someone was really wanting to be with me? Well, maybe if they pay me money. Again, total speculation. When she's growing up, if you are abandoned and there's a lot of chaos, children will sometimes, and I've said this before, they will resort to gauging their attachment and security through gifts and monetary things, because they're not getting their attachment needs through regular ways. Like a real common breeding ground for this schema and this perspective is you have divorce in a family and one parent moves away and the child feels abandoned by that parent and is desperate for closeness and security and attention and love and warmth with that parent. And then every once in a while, the parent either sends a gift or comes to town, gives a lot of gifts, and goes away. You rinse and repeat that enough times, and the child is like, well, I'm not going to get security, but he does get me gifts, so that means that he thinks about me. And so I can rely on that when he buys me things, it means that he's at least kind of thinking about me and kind of cares about me. And so when you're desperate and thirsty and you haven't had any water for a month, you don't care if it's a puddle or a bottled, clear bottled water. You'll drink the puddle, and over time you're like, well, I'm never going to get the clean water, but the puddle, it really is, I want that. I want that. So over time, you rinse and repeat that. And you might only focus on the puddle, even though there's bottled water coming your way, because you just learned to not even look for that or trust that it actually is real, because it never was real growing up. And so you might really focus on money, 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 and not focus on actually things that will actually fulfill you, because you gave up on that a long time ago. And so she goes online, she tries to attract someone along those lines. She finds someone that is in line with that. She comes to the States. Deep down, she really wants closeness for the very first time. But when they get into a fight, she retreats and will start to talk about money, 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 when in reality, underneath it all is this normal feeling of wanting to get attachment security. That's my best guess. And so then when she is fantasizing about coming to the States and being with George, in her mind, it feels like it's going to be great, because she needs to believe that. Think Darcy, when she first meets Jesse or Tom or Georgie, there's this fantasy that she lives in, not because she's a weird person, but because she is desperate for something to work out, for her self-esteem, for attachment security. And when you're so desperate for something to be true, you will believe it to be true. It's like people who have a terminal illness and are obviously and understandably very afraid and are looking for some solution to the terminal illness. Some scam artists will come along and sell them snake oil, and the individual is much more prone to believing that it could work, because you're desperate and nothing else is working. So you'll believe in anything. So she could have thought, well, I'm going to come to the States and it's going to work this time. The way he talks, he's so nice and he has all this money, and you build this fantasy in your mind. This is going to be great. It's going to absolutely work, because I need it to work. She comes to the States. It doesn't work, partially because of him and partially because of her personality. And then she's like, what's going wrong here? The black and white thinking, all bad, all good. But the way she talks about it, it's, he doesn't give me attention and I'm bored. But really what's happening is my fantasy and my, the desperation that I have is being completely unsatisfied. And I don't know what to do, and I'm extremely distraught. But I could be just making up a story. I know a lot of people think that she's this, cold-hearted person who just wants money, and he's this misogynistic person who is a liar, and he's like a man boy, I think people will say. And I don't know. I just don't see it that way, honestly. It could be true, but I've never seen that in reality. I've never seen someone like Anfisa who exhibits the behavior, and after getting to know them, for a few years, conclude that my initial, impression was accurate. Our initial impression of her is that she's on the cold side and also just out for money. But You just imagine if you really got to know her, like what would actually be there. It could be not my hypothesis, it could be something else, but there's definitely a lot of depth to both of these people that isn't apparent by watching the show. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Use the link below or the promo code Kirk because that really helps us out. Let's talk about burnout. Signs of burnout include difficulty concentrating, no motivation, irritability. Are you working too much, not taking enough time for yourself? Often, burnout will just creep up on us, and before long, we've had months, if not years, of being worn thin, Well, that's where therapy comes in. I remember when I was getting burnt out in graduate school, having a therapist to talk to once a week was a lifesaver. And you often hear me saying that BetterHelp can be a really convenient option for getting therapy. Also, online therapy has been demonstrated by empirical research to be just as effective as in-person therapy. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can get matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/Kirk. That's betterhelp.com/Kirk. Get the help you need. You deserve it.
I don't think George realizes that it's really hard for me, and I would like him to be more supporting and understanding.
So what do you think that we need to do now for you and I to be happy?
I'm not thoughts completely.
Yeah, again, just running on this hypothesis. One, she is probably in a mode of keeping everything under wraps because she doesn't want to humiliate herself or she doesn't want to lose it. And she might be in a protective mode. So she might not even have an answer to that question, partially because she's cut herself off from her own feelings, or she finds herself going down avenues in her mind where she's like, well, that's going to result in, from my experience, a lot of conflict and a lot of me showing a side of myself that I don't want to show. That's what I would suspect is happening for her. And if you ask people with these kinds of schemas and these kinds of traumas and these kinds of personalities, it's really hard for them to navigate questions like that. Like, well, what should we do? Especially if they don't have a lot of insight or healing. It's like asking someone, it's like asking me, what are we supposed to do about climate change? Just like, because there are answers, but none of them feel possible or likely to work because of the experience of dealing with government, society, and humans and misinformation. And so when you ask someone that kind of question, there's often just like, I don't know.
It's just hard because I don't have my family here, and I feel lonely.
Now, this is a nice moment. I commend her for being vulnerable and not being accusatory, which a lot of people will do in life and on the show in a destructive way, so she's not doing that. I think this is getting closer to her core, but not entirely. She's saying, I need more attention, I'm lonely, I'm bored, lonely. But I think the bigger issue is I've always felt alone, and I thought that you would be my person that would finally make me feel not alone, but I still feel alone, and I'm desperate, and I don't know what to do.
I totally get it. It's hard for me too, because sometimes I feel like you don't appreciate what I do for you, like all those long hours.
And obviously the landscape that they are talking about between the lines is that he works and she will pester him. She will want to talk to him. She will want to be there with him. And we've seen those scenes. I don't know if I'm reading it right, but it certainly looks that way. And so he says, I totally get that. It was good. He says, but it's hard because I have to work a lot. And then she starts to roll her eyes.
And I would come
Just
home.
because I missed you. Not because of any other reason.
Yeah. So I think this is a real honest conversation. I don't think it's getting at the full breadth of the situation, but I think it is basically the topic sentence. And she's saying, yeah, I pester you at work because I miss you, and I get angry because I miss you. I think that is being vulnerable, and I wonder how she's able to reveal this to him, even on camera. I wonder if I was to hypothesize, I would say that, one, the chance of them breaking up is higher. When I've talked about this in other videos, where there's a cycle to people with these personalities where they, and I won't go over it again, but there's a reconciliation phase. It's not necessarily abusive, it can be, but there's a reconciliation phase where in that phase, the person with the abandonment traumas and the reactivity will realize this relationship might be over. Either they're going to leave me or I'm going to leave them. And there's an interesting state that they will get into because there's a lot of impulses to attack and to demand and control, but they know that if they entertain those impulses, the other person will definitely leave. And that's the landscape they're in right now. I think there's been talk from him towards her about that. And he's like, we're coming up at the end of the 90 days. And so if we don't get married, then you're just going to have to go home. And so I think she's realizing that either probably subconsciously, not consciously, that this could really end. So I can't relax. I can't be myself. I can't allow my normal impulses to come out. So I'm going to suppress that, and probably not actively, but because I've seen this cycle many, many times, not only observing in clients with their own relationships, but observing their relationships with me, because people with these kinds of traumas and personalities, a big part of my therapy with them is to highlight the relationship between me and them, because then it gives us a chance to, instead of talking about other people, we can talk about us and utilize the relationship for insight for them and also corrective experiences for them. Insight meaning they might believe that I have an urge to terminate them as a client, and they'll be paranoid about that. And so it's very helpful for them to voice that with me, and then I can explain and prove to them that that's not true, and thus they can learn, one, that they have assumptions about other people that aren't always true, which is a major question mark that they absolutely need to have in their life, and two, that they can learn that people will value them enough to want to have them as a client, and not to reject them just because of who they are. But anyway, so I think she's in that phase where she's thinking, oh, this could end. And so there's a more tender side that will emerge in people like this. And you can imagine it being very attractive, seductive, or compelling to the Georges of the world, where you have been dealing with all of this anger and control and attacking and keying of a car. And you're like, why is she doing this to me? Lisa, you're killing me. What is the saying that he says? Anyway, in the room. Anyway, and then there's this, you get demoralized and you just feel totally, in despair. And then all of a sudden, as you're about to leave or the relationship seems like it's done, there's tenderness that happens, and you get your hopes up, and you're like, oh, thank God, this is what I've been waiting for so long. But what is actually happening is you're finally in a regular relationship. This isn't wonderful. This is just normal behavior. But with your own traumas, if you're George, but really anyone, if you've ever been in a relationship with someone with a personality just like this, regardless of your traumas, it will have that effect. There's this notion that there are certain people that are susceptible to this kind of cycle, whether we call it abusive cycle or some other kind of emotional roller coaster cycle, that somehow there's a certain sort of person that will be attracted to that. And there are certain profiles that might be more attracted or more likely to be with someone like this. But really anyone, you put anyone with someone like that, and there's this desperation that ends up happening inside of you, particularly if you're in love with someone. And so then when this happens, this phase happens, you could imagine the Georges of the world just being like, oh, I love you so much and I'm so sorry. And then then it elicits a lot of connection and a lot of vulnerability and a lot of security for the Anfisas of the world. And then when the security is felt well enough by the Anfisas, then they relax, and then those impulses are allowed to come out, and then we're back to the whole cycle again. And it just happens over and over and over again until the Anfisas of the world get specialist therapy for their issues. I could be making all this up. I want to say that. I am saying this more as an education for y'all about this sort of thing, which I know some of you have been on either side of this equation. Some of you know that you are an Anfisa. Some of you have been in a relationship with an Anfisa. Some of you have had a parent who was an Anfisa, or at least the way that I'm characterizing it, not necessarily Anfisa. We don't know anything about really what's going on with her, but that's why I'm saying all this stuff, because then, one, if you're a clinician, you can learn more about this sort of thing, because this isn't one of those things that is actually taught in graduate school usually, especially in the depth that I go into. And I'm not saying that narcissistically. I'm saying that in graduate school, although it can be 3 to 6 years of post-grad work, post-bachelor's degree education, you'd be surprised at how little time that is to actually educate people on the necessary things in mental health. And personality disorders and schemas and depth psychology issues are something that are put on the back burner, sometimes not discussed at all. Or if they are, it's a very introductory course that gets you kind of introduced to some of these ideas. But so if you're a clinician, you can learn from this, as I have from people in my past. And if you're not a clinician, you can gain some awareness and seek help because a big part of getting the right kind of therapy is knowing what your issue is, right? If, it's sort of like when, say, you have a stomach ache and you go to a physician, usually there's a phase where you're trying to figure out what the problem is. Do you have to go to a GI specialist? Is it a psychiatry issue? Is it a diet issue? Is it a heart issue or a back issue or something else? And then you go to the specialist. Well, in my field, there isn't that mechanism usually. We don't usually go to a general practitioner therapist, assess over time, and then go to a specialist. You usually just go straight to a therapist. You're essentially going straight to a specialist, and because each therapist specializes typically in a different thing. And so it's up to you as a client to kind of figure out what sort of therapy should I seek? What sort of questions do I ask? And it puts a lot of burden on the clients, which is a huge problem, by the way. So a big part of getting the help that you need and deserve and could benefit from is actually being able to understand at least the possibility as to what your issue is, such that you could actually find the specialist, because you would know what to ask for, know what to look for. So that's another reason why I do this.
Okay, I see what you mean. For the first time since Anfisa got here, she's opening up a little bit more. And it feels really good. I put myself in her shoes and I see what the problem is. I try my hardest to give you as much of my time as I possibly can.
So you hear it, right? That he's like, oh, for the first time, she's being vulnerable and reasonable. But it's not a lot. If you just think about the average vulnerability and emotional maturity, it's still not there yet. These facial expressions that she's making, either the indifference or the resting rejection face that she has. And I don't think that's by mistake. I think she's actually trying to communicate something. Either she doesn't know that's how she's coming across, but it is an expression of what's happening for her on the inside, and her face betrays what's actually happening. Or she actually is actively wanting to reject because she's angry, and as a result of, I think, an ongoing sense of rejection and pain that she goes through, regardless of what's happening in her life. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.